Trump likes the chaos. So the fact that various members of his support group are fighting, in one way, it reinforces kind of the unpredictability of the Trump administration, which is a big asset from his perspective. And it also reinforces that, his view that he's the king and boys will be boys and these spats will happen.
Hi, I'm Joe Crawford and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Today I'm joined by Seth Radwell, US political analyst, speaker and author of the book American Schism. Thank you for joining me on the Trump Report today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
We heard Vance say that there's potentially going to be some sort of great agreement there between the UK and America, and that they're working very hard to create some sort of trade deal. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this because Vance pointed to Trump having several business relationships with the UK, but also Vance mentioned about the Trump's love of the late Queen and also the King, and also that there's a real cultural affinity, in his words, between the two countries. It sounds quite promising for the UK.
Well, it sounds quite promising, but it has to be put in context of the types of statements and rhetoric that this administration's become well known for. And certainly during Trump 1, we heard plenty of it. So what I mean by that is that in the view of the administration, at least in their narrative, they're working on trade deals bilaterally with all these different countries, which is in the Trump administration's view, the way forward. And the strategy, if you can call it that, was to put these tariffs in place all over the world. And then Trump's goal was to have each individual country come kind of crawling to him with bend the knee and kiss the ring and flatter him and offer him a deal, quote unquote. It's about the deal. So I think you have to put those comments in the context. Now, it's certainly true that Trump has had an affinity with the Queen, the late Queen, and Britain for a while. So it's possible that they will get a deal. But I think that's the situation with many of the former allies of the U.S. I say former because I think that it's certainly that the approach that Trump has taken has certainly challenged, stressed the traditional alliances that the U.S. has built overseas.
It's interesting when you say this idea of, Trump wants to have these countries bang down, kissing the ring. But then we saw, for example, when Trump, he paused the higher rates of tariffs, a lot of people said that, this was Trump blinking first. Do you think that perhaps he's losing that position of power?
I think that there certainly was the combination of the crashes and the volatility in the stock market, along with, in fact, the warnings that we may have been on the cusp of a collapse of the bond market, certainly scared Trump. And I think that his business associates around him kind of convinced him to make these concessions. So I do think, I think his initial kind of braggadocio, if you will, his statement and his putting this kind of strong foot forward has been to some degree given a slap by the market's reactions. Now, what was interesting is I think it was last week when at one point he said he was going to give that 90-day hiatus. You saw the markets bounce back right after he said that, but only to be extremely volatile and fall the next day. So I don't think we're in business as usual. I think we're at the start of what are very volatile times in businesses across the world. In the U.S., the repercussions are just barely being felt. There are many import-export firms that are warning about going out of business. There are, in New York, for example, which is where I'm from, there's many importers, and already because so many have been forecasting a very troubled time, the real estate owners are worried that they're canceling leases. So there's a lot of downstream effects that are still to be felt. And I do think there's a much stronger chance that we will go into a recession. So that's kind of where we are right now. Now, whether or not this forces Trump to back down or concede. We'll see.
We also heard Vance suggesting that other European states were likely to reach some new trade agreements there too, but he still continued to criticize Europe, saying that security infrastructure relied too heavily on the US, but he did exclude the UK, France, and Poland as exceptions to that rule. I mean, we've heard Vance being very openly, but also privately critical of Europe, as we heard him at the Munich Security Conference, but then also in that leaked Signal group chat. How do you think Vance feels about forming trade agreements with European countries?
I think Vance's entire philosophy is driven by this alternative narrative of where we are in history and what the place of the U.S. is in the world. It's very much described, and I'm not sure to what degree your listeners are familiar with the New Right, but from the perspective of Vance, and even someone philosophically behind this movement for over a decade now, Steve Bannon, there's a goal for kind of the what is sometimes called the illiberal democratic paradigm, the kind of Viktor Orban, or what usually are in fact strong leaders, often usually men, strong man leaders, who control the narrative in a country, and under the pretenses of a populist or nationalist populist notion, whilst maintaining that the traditional orthodoxy on the left is an infringement on free speech, and that these rightist parties need to be able to be heard without censure. Now, what's interesting, so there's a sanctimonious criticism of let's call it censoriousness on the left, but at the same time, I think it's hypocritical in some ways because there's also a control of the narrative from these same actors on the right. So there's a lot of hypocrisy here. But yes, there is this overall narrative that parties like Marine Le Pen's party in France, or Orban in Hungary, or other players, yet Bolsonaro in Brazil, have been quote unquote silenced.
And I mean, when we go back to that Signal group chat leak, it appeared to be one of the first times that we've encountered Vance and the president differing in opinion since the inauguration. I mean, the VP said in that chat that these Houthi strikes, they were inconsistent with the president's messaging on Europe. Do you think that we can start to see Vance and Trump moving in separate ways here on their positions on Europe?
I certainly think Trump has a tendency to be less critical of Europe the way Vance has been. But I think the real division, the real potential split in the Trump base is much more likely to be kind of the philosophical right of Vance with and let's say Vance and Bannon with the Silicon Valley kind of intellectual right of people like, or let's say entrepreneurial, probably intellectual is the wrong term, entrepreneurial right of people like Musk and Anderson and those types. So I think there's much more of a likely split there. Kind of will the populists and the entrepreneurial right, along with the financial right, people like Bill Ackman who supported Trump. I mean, if you watch Trump's support amongst the moneyed interests, both on both coasts, they kind of cascaded over like dominoes. And so they all got behind the Trump campaign, starting with not only Musk, but people in Silicon Valley, and then some of the Wall Street types. So I guess the split that I see most likely in terms of the Trump base is that group, because their interests will diverge from the Steve Bannons of the world.
And I want to pick you up on Musk here because we definitely haven't heard too much from him in the last week or so. I mean, it was reported that Musk unsuccessfully tried to persuade Trump to adopt a zero tariff approach between the US and Europe. And we also heard him say that to Trump's trade advisor that he was a moron. I mean, where do you think that Musk stands with Trump right now?
I think, first of all, you have to understand that Trump likes the chaos. So the fact that various members of his support group are fighting, in one way, it reinforces kind of the unpredictability of the Trump administration, which is a big asset from his perspective. And it also reinforces that, his view that he's the king and boys will be boys and these spats will happen. So I don't think Trump is particularly concerned about these types of splits. In fact, I think he likes them. I think he likes the fact that his as the mafia don, if you will, that his henchmen have their, and I'm sorry for these analogies, but they've been used a lot, but they're frankly very accurate in terms of the MO. That I think he likes when his henchmen have some spats and he can control it all. So I think, though, to your point, how much can you mask if there's a real divergence of interests? So, for example, on tariffs, the business community as well as Musk were very against tariffs, but yet, Trump's moving forward based on the populist nationalist agenda that he's had. So, at some point, will that create a rift that's too large to bridge? I don't know. That's the question.
It's interesting that you say that he likes that idea of chaos within his administration. But when I think back to his first administration, we had a lot of traditional Republican figures there. And it was sort of regarded that for this second administration, Trump wanted to surround himself with yes men and people that would support his decisions. So I guess, how does that work and play into this idea of him liking that chaos and spats between people within his administration?
Well, first of all, I think his approach has been centered around loyalty and putting yes people. He'd much rather have loyal people than competent people around him. It's clear. Now, in the first, and that, he made that clear in the first administration with the famous Comey interview when he fired Comey. So, in the first administration, he was constrained by the various powers of the traditional institutions, let's say, including Congress, but also in the Justice Department, the State Department, the various public institutions that have been built up over decades, if not longer, that are meant to contain the president's unilateral power. I think this time, the combination of him having a popular vote mandate in his view, and the fact that he's kind of more untethered, allow him to be even more reckless in that regard. I mean, if you just look at the cabinet that he's built around him, you have a large quotient of loyalty and a very questionable one of competence. So I think that is the Trump MO. He doesn't care that much about competence as much as loyalty. Now, I think in general, this is true of Trump, but it's also very much a theme, if you will, in the zeitgeist that we're living through. So, the populist nationalist movement that's been growing for a decade has a tremendous disdain for elites and for expertise. And so, in a way, it's almost an asset to not have expertise. To be incompetent in some ways is better than being a competent elite. So we have a reversal of the world that is beyond Trump. Now, Trump may have been a key agent in bringing this forward, but it's been happening for a while, going back, to Brexit, for example, and the things that we've seen in the last 10 years.
But do you think that this is working in Trump's favor by having these untraditional, perhaps inexperienced individuals working in Trump's administration? We hear him saying that he wants to drain the swamp, and that's why he's brought these people in. But when we look to the Signal group chat leak, critics suggested that because of this inexperience from the team, that is why this all happened. I mean, how do you think that's working for Trump?
Okay, so the entire framework here is not about like even the Signal leak. I'm sure they would have preferred that not happen. But this is an administration and a leader who's managed to dodge and be all errors. He's not been held accountable legally or by the public yet, despite his presence on the scene for 10 years now, if not longer. So I don't think, I think it shows the the Signal chat episode shows the incompetence. Yes, it shows that these are, in fact, they're not experienced players in this type of state play, state leadership, both in terms of their methods, their uses, and their practices. They don't appreciate kind of the way the protocols rely on secrecy, on using vested channels, etc. Now, what's amazing about it is they're not held accountable, but they're also extremely hypocritical, because if you remember, Hillary Clinton's email server, which was, of course, not dissimilar and probably less dangerous than the Signal chat episode, was a rallying cry for how crooked the elite are. So there's a tremendous hypocrisy here, Joe. But that being said, I think that Trump and his team can act with a fair amount of impunity. They are not being held accountable. The whole the whole premise of transparent governance that we've worked on for a generation or two is being turned on its head. It used to be that the types of moneyed interests being aligned with presidential power were a no-no. They were continually exposed and shunned if they existed at all. Now it's commonplace. I mean, Trump surrounds himself with folks that does business with folks that he has private interests with in terms of the Trump Corporation, and it's there's no shame in doing so in public. So again, you have to, if you're asking how this is all working, you have to really appreciate the degree to which the old order, the public institutional based order that has ruled has ruled America or been the American mainstay for 80 years post World War II is crumbling. I mean, Trump's taking it down, and that's that. I don't think. What I think the real question is not whether that order will come down. It is coming down. The question is what will replace it.
And I'm interested in your wording there about, lack of accountability. But then on the other hand, you said that Trump likes this idea of chaos, of inside spats, things like that. And also lack of experience as well that you're mentioning there. I mean, how sustainable is that, though? Not just in terms of Trump's administration, but also in terms of Trump's reputation with the public.
It's something that continually surprises elites and people in the media. The media and the elite population thought that COVID was going to be the end of Trump because the way he handled it by turning it not only into such a political football on every turn, but in not successfully bringing people together, as well as using the COVID platform as a propaganda tool for his pronouncements, if you remember those daily briefings. So, I think many in the media and in elite circles thought that would be the end of Trump, that even before January 20th, the way he mismanaged, let's say, COVID. Now, that wasn't. Then we had January 6th, and we thought that would be the end of Trump, and it wasn't. So I don't think I think that we're operating in a world where the rage amongst working class Americans, the built up rancor and acrimony at having been not only ignored but scorned by elite establishments of both parties for so long is something that is hard to really grasp how deep it is. But it certainly is deep enough that it's not yet had MAGA turn on Trump. And I'm not sure it ever will. I mean, I think the MAGA base have become that 30% of Americans, let's say, who idolize Trump. It's true that he could do no wrong. Now, the question is the other 20% that voted for him, where are they? These are people who never really loved him, but who thought it was better than Harris or Biden and didn't like. So that it's that 20% that of the public that is movable in terms of whether he can sustain power. But so far, he's managed to do it.
We are hearing reports from how services of agencies being cut by Musk's Doge is having an impact on Americans. Do you think that's going to impact the MAGA cohort?
So there's two things. The people who are very upset about the cuts in the federal government are insiders in the Beltway and in departments that work in the government. So these are not working class Americans. So the first order effect, I think it will have no impact at all. What you're referring to is when the services themselves are cut back. Yeah. So as these agencies close and services are cut back, the economic interests of much of MAGA might be affected. And I think that potentially could have an impact on the 20%. The 30% loyalists, I think, are willing to forego economic benefit if they can champion the emotional causes of Trump. So I think that 30%, even if they're hurt economically, they've been shown to not vote in their economic interests already. So I don't think they're movable. But I do think the 20% that went along with Trump, if services cutbacks like Medicaid, VA benefits, Social Security Administration benefits, If these start affecting that 20%, that could be a movement.
I want to turn to Ukraine quickly. I guess you could say that it has taken the back seat while these tariffs have dominated headlines, especially in the last week. But we heard Trump yesterday, he blamed Zelensky for starting the war in Ukraine alongside Biden and Putin. I mean, when Trump was asked about Zelensky, he said, when you start a war, you've got to know you can win the war. You don't start a war against somebody that's 20 times your size. I mean, it appears that Trump is going along with parroting this Kremlin narrative. I mean, just days after those 35 people were killed by Russian missiles in Ukraine.
Trump does not give up on his narrative, even when it's false. Going back to the election of 2020, this is the old, kind of Roy Cohn. He continues to repeat the lies so often that they end up being believed by some folks. I mean, that is the strategy. So, there was a famous moment. This is years after the kind of 2020 election was adjudicated, and the courts, of course, found no fraud, where he was interviewed in a town hall on CNN, and he continued to maintain that he had won the election. And the CNN anchors were almost incredulous. Like, aren't we past this? Like, don't you concede? And he would not concede. So he continues to repeat the lies, such as Zelensky and Ukraine started the war. In his narrative, that's what it is. The only difference between perception and reality is the degree to which perception affects reality. And in Trump world and in the MAGA world, and I think in the kind of the new digispace, what matters is what's repeated the most often. That it becomes real. So we're in an alternate reality again, and so if Trump says it enough times, enough people will believe it. And it's almost like a new form of postmodernism. If you think back to the great writings of the Austrian school in the 50s and 60s of last century, and even through Foucault in the 80s, this notion of the only difference there's no difference between justice and power. Justice is whatever those who are in power say it is. And we're living in a world like that.
We know that Trump wants to get some sort of deal there. What benefit is it for Russia to continue with these strikes? It counters that messaging that Trump's trying to achieve there of trying to get that deal that he's sort of pining after, could you say?
So I think the deal that he's going after is basically to allow Russia to win. It's to have Ukraine concede. I mean, when we say the outcome that he's driving for, yes, is peace. And he wants the war to stop. And by the way, he wants the war to stop so he can be seen as the great, so he can get the Nobel Peace Prize. That's what he's aiming for. So he, as the savior of that war. So that he wants the war to stop, but he foresees a denouement, or an outcome that is very much along the lines that I mentioned, with Ukraine conceding territory, like it did in 2014 with Crimea, and creating a new norm where Russia has recaptured the Donbass and assured themselves that they won't have a NATO member on their border.
Seth Radwell, thank you so much for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Great. Thanks very much.